question really came from Amy during this meeting. And I remember how she did it. And the question is, what does allyship mean to you? And do you have any personal stories, perhaps in your journey as you've experienced allyship, about what either worked or what you've not experienced allyship and when you expect it to? So we're going to throw it to the board and y'all just have at it.
I can start this one.
Sure.
I have a pretty simple, short-worded answer for my definition of allyship, but I think it's not just making sure everything in your world is okay, but going out and seeking other people's worlds and their realities and seeing how you can help their worlds be okay and all of them kind of being cohesive. And then an example is my first job out of college. I had like my boss who I worked with, and then I had a bunch of administrators, and my job was in a broad way kind of connecting all of the groups. I had a lot of projects where I took a lot from a bunch of different groups, but the administrator, so my boss would give me jobs to do and tell me to reach out to these administrators, and one administrator, every single email I sent, he would CC my boss and reply to my boss instead of me. So from the Gen Z perspective, I was not taken seriously even though I had stepped out of the student role and into the employee role. And it just kind of took away my power a little bit. And not necessarily to put blame on this person, because maybe they were used to working with my boss and it was just a routine to go straight to and from my boss. But maybe just if they could have opened up their perspective to see like, okay, this new person, young or old, has this new role, let's adapt. I think that would be like a point of learning, I guess.
Thank you, Katie.
Yeah, I can jump in. So as like a person of color that grew up in a primarily white town and studied in primarily white institutions, like I think it's been a very interesting experience to receive allyship from people. And I think, you know, of course there are certain challenges that I've experienced or faced, and the biggest thing that I've always appreciated in terms of allyship was being listened to and heard. Not necessarily that, you know, a friend has to go and take action or that they need to do something, even though that's definitely an important aspect of allyship. But at its base level, I think what's been really key for me and pivotal for me has been being able to be heard. And so I think, you know, when we think, sometimes we get carried away with like, you know, we need to be doing a million things or do so much and, you know, feel like we need to take on every single problem. But sometimes, even if you don't have the answer, or if you don't have the solution or the ability to necessarily act on it, the least that someone can do is listen to someone else and try to make sure that they're being heard, because that alone can help someone kind of navigate whatever challenges or complexities that they're feeling in their life. So to me, allyship is, you know, at its base, just being heard and listened to and feel like the world is responding to and resonating with what I'm experiencing.
Thank you. I love that. Thank you. Thank you.
I think allyship is showing up and knowing when it's right to intervene and like being intentional about understanding that difference. So I think I'd have countless examples of like experiencing good allyship, but I think one of them that always resonates is I was in a class and a professor was saying something that was just like really messing me up, and I didn't know how to react to it. I just kind of shut down, and one of my classmates was watching this happen in real time, and like they came up to me after the class, asked if I was okay, which was, you know, way more than anyone else in that room did at the moment, and then asked if I was comfortable with them going to the professor to explain why I was upset in that moment. Just like, yeah, that's what showing up looks like, and it's also like being able to ask permission and not like overstep that boundary, and really like communicating as best you can.
I have one thought about this question in particular, because this question I have struggled with personally for a long time. In fact, I was just having a conversation with a friend about this very question last night, because I've noticed a trait in myself is that one of my biggest pet peeves is when someone is going through something really hard, and then a friend or someone in the community or like just someone nearby, sees or witnesses that acknowledges that person is going through something hard, and then they say, oh, that's too hard. Like, I don't want to like get involved with that. I'm like, I had experiences in college where like, I witnessed a roommate who went through something really tragic, and then, their friends started to drift away from them because they were like, it's too difficult for me to watch you suffer, to be around that necessarily. So I was telling my friend about how this is like such a big pet peeve of mine. Like when other people are going through SHIT and you're not even the person experiencing it, but it's like, you're deciding how much you want to engage with that, and just like when you are in a place of greater privilege because you're not going through that thing, not being willing to be there for them. And so my friend was like, yeah, that's a good, that's valid and that's a good point. But then there's this other piece where, like, to what extent, like allyship, I wonder if it exists on a spectrum too. Like most things do. But like, to what extent are you going to give yourself into this cause, into this, other person's situation, like, to an extent that is not, detrimental to you in an unhealthy way, but also, allyship requires sacrifice. Like, Alex brought up the important point of sacrifice too. So it's like, it's a balance. It's got to be like, you have to, one, acknowledge the context of your privilege. Like, what is your privilege that allows you to like give in a way that like another person in a different situation is not able to give because of just, who you are, where you grew up, like, what kind of resources you come from. And then at the same time, it's interesting, we are in a room of givers, like here. I think that's why we've all gathered here somehow together, and that's why we're connected. So we naturally have that inclination to give and to, sometimes forget about our own health and, wellness. So it's important that we've brought that into the discussion here. But like, this has been a question I have struggled with a lot. And like, Ariel had this experience where it only took a friend, going up to them after class. Like, that, in terms of exhaustion and in terms of like giving, like that is not a huge sacrifice, but it's conscientious, it's thoughtful, and it's impactful. And so thinking about ways to do that, and sometimes when you need to take it a step further, like taking that step further, and when you have the ability and the privilege and the energy and whatever to do that, like, but being very selective. I don't know, it's hard when you got a big giving heart like all of you do, but like just being really thoughtful about like how to amplify your impact and like be an ally in ways that aren't, that are healthy for everyone around you.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in, and I would encourage the other panelists to like maybe join in on what I'm trying to say, because I'm not sure I've fully fleshed out this idea, but from listening to the other responses, I think that a lot of allyship is also about trust.
Yes.
You need to be able to trust other people, to welcome them into your life, and trust them enough to be able to, be there for you, and they need to trust you enough to, be willing to, again, go through that sacrifice and be an ally for someone else. So I think that kind of relationship of trust is really important to allyship too. And I think that, in this day and age, that's something that I think like our world struggles with a lot, because as we all know, there's so much disconnection or over-connection, and it's hard to build that kind of very true connection with someone and find that trust in today's world. And so I think that that's, especially for young people, like a really important thing. Like, how do we learn to trust someone else enough and welcome and open ourselves up to allyship and be able to provide allyship in a trustful manner as well?
And also recognizing that trust takes time, and like, levels of trust can happen at different times, and there has to be like this mutual willingness to put in the work to create the trust, and in a recognition that like, even with the best intentions, like trust may not be built as easily as we want it to. And so yeah, just like recognizing that and like being willing to put in the work to build that trust over time.
And I think there's a lot to do with like honesty there as well.
Yeah.
I think that a part of that trust conversation is also like not letting our own egos get too caught up in things, like feeling like, I need to do this because I need to, this says something about me, or I need to do this because this is what this person expects, or this is what this person needs, or like taking that me out of that situation and being honest enough to know that your ego doesn't have a place in a trustful allyship, I think is also important.
I think it's hard because like good faith efforts at allyship can be counterproductive. Like I think we've heard like I think everyone has sort of hinted at that in their responses, and like we've all been a part of, or perhaps like even ourselves, like intervened into a situation where like it was not welcome or it was not productive. So I think that that's what's so scary about it, is that like it has the potential, because these are like inherently going to be personal and these are like inherently personal and complicated situations, that it has the potential to sort of backfire or not. I guess I just like I'm thinking there are more examples in my head right now of like times when I've seen this like go sort of south, and so I think like Ariel, like in your example, like if your classmate had come up to you and been like, I'm going to the professor because I saw you were uncomfortable. That's not okay. I'm going and I'm going to tell the professor that Ariel is uncomfortable. Like, right? Like that would not have made you feel safe, heard, all of it, right? Yeah. But like that is kind of a react. I mean, I've seen that reaction. I've felt the like desire to react in that way to tough situations. Yeah. So I guess not to leave it all on a negative point. Like I think as long as it is not, if you are serving as the ally, as long as it is like not prescriptive at all, and you like start from the place of like curiosity, and you don't, you ask permission to be an ally, especially if it involves like involving a third party or going to the source of, where this like where the allyship is needed, then that's especially important. But I think like as an ally, you want to empower as much as possible, and like that is just hard.
And just to tie it back a little bit to like youth, the youth aspect of this, I think that the reason we've all been kind of touching upon that topic is that I think there are so many times today where we see as young people, other young people engaged in, allyship, or engaged in like making a change and doing what we hope young people can, like doing what we want young people to do. But we also, on the other sense, have also seen so many instances where it's gone wrong and where it's performative and it's not, genuine. And I think that's why this kind of line of discussion has occurred, is because, we want to talk about allyship in its like truest form, and not the sort of performative allyship that we might have thought about 10 years ago before, social media has exposed it to so many, forms of allyship and so many causes that we support and things like that.
Yeah. Have any advice for us in entering that, those types of situations?
I feel like one of the questions that's so helpful is when someone asks, like, how can I best support you right now? Right? And really just like providing space for options and contemplation there. Because sometimes people just need someone to vent. Like sometimes you really just like need a hug, and so like being able to create those options and that opportunity, and not even like making any assumptions at all. It's just like, how can I best support you right now? And like, we can check in later, but like, in this moment, what's the best way for me to support you?
Love that.
And like, with the phrasing of that question, how can I best support you? That's even better than, can I support you right now?
Right.
Because can I support you is more of, is it going to be a burden?
Yeah.
Is this an empty gesture?
Yeah.
But saying, how can I support you? Then you have the freedom to answer, you know what, I'm doing well right now. Yeah. Just honestly, like, there's nothing really I need. But that just, I think, is more of a genuine, I'm ready to do something now. What is it?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, those are such amazing points. And building off like every concrete gesture or action that we're talking about there, like asking very specifically, like doing the work, laying it out right in front of them, so they don't have to do the work of like coming to you and asking for something in particular. Or behind every activity we're doing, I think behind that all is moving power from where it isn't to where it should be. And that requires action. So depending on like what you're deciding to do in a given situation, like think like, how is that empowering, disempowering, or keeping level, like, how this individual is feeling, and taking into context, a whole bunch of complex factors that, gives them whatever level of power they have in that moment. So whether that means like employing like, financial resources like microgrants, that's a movement of power from one hand into another, whether it's like the way you talk to someone, like the listening is a physical, concrete way to give power to someone, saying, I am literally giving you my time, energy, like I am here for you, you are empowered to tell me what I'm ready to listen. Like it's all about that behind the scenes, like power issue, like whatever we choose to do in the situation.
Love it. One, before we move on from this question, several of you guys mentioned about listening. And I think when you have a room of people that want to make a difference, it's easy to jump and say, what can I do? What can I do? And a lot of times I'm hearing you say that that's not always what's wanted. What are things that perhaps we can hear or sense to know that this is where we just perhaps need to be just an ear? Maybe we just need to just be a place for you to resource. Are there things that we can hear, tangible things?
Well, I honestly think anytime that we're doing listening in these situations, like I want to key in specifically on listening without objective, listening without like some sort of end goal, listening without necessarily an action, or like, again, taking the me out of that listening aspect, listening just for the sake of listening. Like absorbing things, I think is going to be far more valuable, because then you can, really focus on what this person is trying to communicate, rather than the exterior pieces, such as how are they framing it, what's the context, and like you can get lost in these other pieces of a vocal conversation when you start to try to create a mental map of like what's the end goal here, what's the end result, what's the action. If we take out that piece and we really just think about doing the action for the action itself, just listening for the sake of listening, I think that we eliminate these external pieces that distract us from what the meaning of what that person is saying is. So I think that's something that I want to emphasize.
And another like really important part of allyship is doing your own homework,
Yes.
right?
Just about to say that.
And just like recognizing that like the person or group that you're being an ally to is not necessarily responsible for teaching, and shouldn't be held responsible for teaching always. I just remember so vividly so many times like trying to do social justice work like in the Upper Valley, and people being so resistant to it just because they hadn't heard a particular term before, or like we just weren't using the same language. And so like something that I often did, it's like, okay, I'm hearing that we're not going to come to like any real conclusion or like have any meaningful dialogue. Here are a few articles, some books, like after you've like done this work, like let's come back, and like I would love to have a conversation with you again, like once we're at like not the same level, but like once we have a baseline understanding, a shared understanding of like where we can come together, and where your allyship would be best used and best like most helpful.
Yeah, I think that's there have been times when like I have been in situations or conversations where I'm like, I just honestly don't understand.
Yeah.
Right? And then it's like, maybe I'm like not ready to be an ally yet, right? Mm-hmm. And then I think, and like obviously it shouldn't stop there where you're like, oh wow, this is way over my head. Like, then like you go, like I think in that situation where someone needs an ally, or you think that someone may need an ally, but you're like really, not from you do not understand the complexity of the situation. Like I've definitely been there, and I think it's like it's hard to go to that person or that group or whatever and like say like I think it's better to go to that group and say like if you feel like it's your time to go in and just be like, hey, like I don't exactly, like I have learning to do, I don't understand exactly like all the nuance of the complexity of the situation, but is there any way that like all the questions we've already asked, or just recognize in yourself, like, I need to go educate myself, understand, maybe talk to someone else who wasn't like directly affected, but may help me like appreciate the nuance before like I make that first, even like ask those first questions. Because I think if it's a really, especially if it's like close to an incident or something, like the person who's been affected or the group that's been affected probably doesn't want to spend a whole lot of time like explaining and educating to you before, right? Like that's probably not their top priority. So I think there's moments where it's probably best to like step back and then, with the intention of, hopefully eventually, offering up that allyship.
And just to, underscore both Ariel and Jasper's points here, I think no matter what the issue is, that perhaps we don't understand, given like if you have privilege in any sort of element or aspect of life, no matter what the issue is, I think one thing we can know, bottom line, is that person that is in need of allyship is probably exhausted. Like exhaustion is to have to explain yourself and just who you are, and like to explain, for example, microaggressions, like as if like a situation is not like, you're concerned somebody won't think your situation is bad enough to need empathy or something. Like you have to like dramatize or prove yourself, like, and that is exhausting. To not only be in that situation of being, whether it's oppressed or just whatever it is, like to then have to go the step further and like convince you like that so to really, like Ariel said, do your homework, understand like you should not have to, like, in addition to going through this trauma, basically like prove that you went through trauma. Like we have to listen, like, and those are, doing your homework is one way to do that.
Yeah, no one should have to ever justify their need for your allyship.
Yes.
I think sometimes you just have to sit with the idea that it's not going to be solved.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's hard. I'm very much wired the same way, and I think, especially the kinds of things that we've been talking about or alluding towards, like those just aren't going to go away. There will always, like, so it, sure, like thinking about ways you can mitigate them as much as possible or create the most inclusive environment, or that's obviously a big part of this, and those are like outcomes are important, and just because things are entrenched and not gonna go away anytime soon doesn't mean we shouldn't tackle them. But I think like part of the journey is just like appreciating that like these things are deeply entrenched and we're working on it, but it's not, it is a long arc.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and to as I listen or think about that exact point, I guess what I'm learning about allyship is the outcome, whatever the oppression or whatever the situation is, may not actually be what I'm trying to resolve.
Sure.
Right? What I'm trying to resolve is your problem,
Yeah.
how you're feeling, or
like
how you're
immediate discomfort.
your immediate discomfort. So,
Yeah.
but I think stepping back from that, which is hard for somebody like me to do, just to be honest, because I just want to help, and I just whatever it is, you just kind of, and you think you could interject, and it's probably not going to eliminate the situation. You're probably not going to do those things. So it's really helpful to do that.
Yeah, I think it also speaks to a larger thing, which is that it's okay to not be okay. I think that's part of that allyship as well, which is that again, we don't immediately need to solve someone's problem, but it's also just mainly to be there for that person in that moment. I think we tend to live our lives in like big thoughts about the future, or like large reflections about the past, and we tend to lose like the everyday here and now moments, and that's where that allyship really comes through, and the majority of it is. Allyship isn't me thinking of a solution for tomorrow or next week. Allyship isn't necessarily looking back 5 years and saying blah blah blah, something else is going on. Like at its base, like I've said, it's about listening, but it's also like being there in that moment, being there for someone, and them realizing that it's okay to not be okay, and I'm here for you however you need me to be there for you.
Yeah.
So your experiences, I mean, as I read through the 6 or 7 ways that you can be an ally,
Yeah.
like every example seemed to have sort of a solution to it, right? As I was reading those and as listening to you, you're better than the book, just for the because what you're saying is that I think what we all have to be comfortable with is that there may not be a solution.
Sure.
Right, you can advocate. So in your example where someone was disrespecting your position as a new employee and CCing your boss may have looked at that and said, hey, you don't need to CC me on these. Katie's in charge of this, and that's why she's emailing you or something. Now that may have felt good for them to support you, but you may have been kind of like, I really would like to handle this myself. So that's kind of the line where it gets fuzzy, and I don't think that it's, there's not one answer, obviously, but
also, that's when you ask, right?
Yeah.
It's
there you go.
like, I noticed that this happened. Like, how would you like to deal with this? Would you like to be the one to do this? Do you want to set up a meeting and the 3 of us are in there together? And just really laying out a few options, letting people choose.
I wanted to tie it a little bit back to positive tracks as well, in the sense that, from what I'm hearing as we're having this conversation is that, a lot of times in allyship, it's just about being there in that moment for someone else, however they need you to be there. And I think that positive tracks, I think the challenge is all about giving you this breath of fresh air. It's giving you the ability to take a pause and have someone coach you and guide you to make an active change in something that might at times feel overwhelming, that might have had hundreds of years of history and might have another 100 years of history in the future. But in this moment, right here, right now, positive tracks is giving you that breath. Positive tracks is giving you that support, that shoulder to lean on. Positive tracks is acting in that allyship manner. And I think that could be a really powerful thing that we do for young people in the kind of world context that we live in.
Totally. As we think about the micro grants, this is something that I keep thinking about. I love the idea. I think it's so awesome. How do we create spaces where students are even comfortable enough to be I don't have money for sneakers, and feel safe even asking for something like that. What's the language and the way that we're advertising something like this, and what does safety look like in that way? Because that's real allyship. And so I don't know. I would love us to think about that a lot, because having those funds available is a big deal, and it's huge and it's incredible and it's really dynamic. But what are we doing to make sure that people feel comfortable enough to even ask for that type of help?
I think that the main thing is just not to make an assumption about any person that you're talking to about whether they do or don't need a microgrant, and to offer it to everybody equally, and to make sure that they understand that is for anyone, for anything.
And we can ask the question how can positive tracks be an ally to our captains and the people that we're looking to engage?
I also positive tracks has a long history of doing this, whether or not we've realized or not. Just the idea that the challenges are on the captain's own turf and terms is a really, really good start. Right? That's always been the vision for these, is that it's we're not going to tell you what to do or how to do it or what to do it for. You choose the activity, you choose the cause, you choose, et cetera, et cetera. That is a really good place to start.
Totally.
I mean, not that we're well beyond the start. I'm just saying, just the basic setup of the program. I think it just automatically gives a lot of power to the the recipient of, if you think about it as a typical a nonprofit, we are giving a lot of power to those who we are serving 100%. Right from the get-go, which is really cool.
Can we have a yes button moment?
Yes, we
You pushed it. You get to pick this activity.
I don't want to pick the activity. I just feel like we need to move. Yeah.
So it just says, as a society, we want to grow and demand more inclusion, voices, and accountability. For example, engaging online and with people from different backgrounds, it can be tricky. So with things like cancel culture, how can we further this community, equity, and belonging work in this like understanding and climate that it can be tricky? Like, how can we, engage online in a way that is honest and that is growing, and that we are creating that space and acknowledgement.
So, panel, wherever you guys want to go.
Yeah, I think that, we touched upon a lot of things that I think are pretty critical to answering this question. Listening without objective, it's okay to not be okay, educating yourself to, learn about something, and specifically, to maybe get it started in terms of like cancel culture and like all of that stuff in our society today. I think that it's all about just like honest learning, and I think that there's a lot of people who don't really know, and they haven't had an opportunity to learn or had, been in a space where they were asked to learn. But I also don't think it's necessarily like other people's responsibilities to teach them this information. But I think we need to create an environment where they feel accepted enough to go search for that information. Where, if you maybe say something that other people don't necessarily agree with, or that maybe isn't the right understanding, you're not immediately shut down, but you're told, maybe you can go check out these resources to learn about certain things. And then, we can continue this conversation or something along those lines. I think most of and this has been the kind of dialogue about cancel culture in the last couple of years, has always been that, it's not about shutting down, it's not about, completely removing someone from the conversation. It's about how can we help these people learn more so they can come back to the conversation with a more, informed perspective, a more, perspective that can help them really connect with and communicate what their actual opinions are or whatever it is.
Yeah. It's like, I just believe that cancel culture stunts growth, like in general, and it stunts connectivity, it limits access, and so like definitely like education is definitely the better tool, and just like redistributing resources in general, like thinking to question number 2 about like what older generations can do for young people. I think one of the best things, and this is something we talk about a lot in the climate space, is like one of the best things that can happen is sharing insights, sharing advice, and sharing resources. Like those are the 3 things that we need the most of, because there's no need for us to like try to reinvent the wheel. We have been doing this work for a long time. This work has existed far before us and definitely will continue. But like, how do we like not replicate bad systems, bad habits, and like how do we maneuver with ease through systems, because other people have like made those ways easier for us. And then just thinking about like cancel culture again, I think like truth and democracy are like 2 of the biggest things that we are like at risk of losing right now. I think with all of the book bans and all of these like challenges to law and to truth, there is just this need to be able to share fact. And so like, like speaking to like the ways that we want like positive tracks to show up online and all of this, I think it's about leaning on the expertise of the young people that we are connecting with, because so many of the young people are from diverse groups that like have insights to share and would be willing and excited to be able to share that to larger and newer audiences, and then also like adding fact. And that's why I like the researcher idea, and like adding like some component of like just like truth-telling, storytelling in the way that we are like sharing information about the organization will be really important moving forward, especially with these 3 programmatic pillars for next year.
This could be a little bit of a jump. But in my work in the legislature recently, I've been doing some things around criminal justice reform. And so there are sort of 2 main lines of thinking, which is like the carceral and the punishment side of things, and then there's the restorative and sort of rebuilding, reintegration side. And so when you look at the facts and the numbers about what keeps a society safest, what works? like to what extent does locking up and increasing punishment length and severity help in creating a better world? Like genuinely, like that, looking at that as a raw question, no underlying biases there, versus what do the numbers show about when you treat the underlying issue of, like, for example, somebody's mental health issue, or literally a lot of our folks in prisons right now have addiction, literally medical health issues that are not being addressed and impacting the reason they're in there. So like we can take that same lens with cancel culture. So bottom line, people are going to make mistakes.
Right. Yeah. Right.
I make a lot of mistakes, and like, so it's about what we do. So do we lock them up, or do we look at what's going on behind the scenes and what are the outcomes of either route, and being thoughtful about that.
Love it.
Totally.
Love that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Not a jump.
Brilliant. Yeah, exactly.
Isn't that a bridge?
Yes.
But Esme, it also went, when you remember I asked for clarification about positive tracks and about the work and about getting at the root cause. I mean, that's what you're getting at,
Totally.
as opposed to treating the symptom.
Yes.
Looking at what's causing it
So
from the
true.
very beginning, and if we
Structurally.
do intervene there, you have real change.
One thing that I have thought about recently, kind of going off of my answer and building upon what we've been talking about, is like, obviously, you can't fight fire with fire. We all know that that's not going to work, but we also can't, be expected to continuously have to like pull the weight of all of these other people that are not, doing their part to be, an active member and a responsible member of our society. And so, I think we all know that it's all about creating the right environment where these people can feel accepted enough to, not to kind of get on board and figure out what they need to figure out to like be able to have this conversation rather than just canceling them. And I'd love to know what some of the other panelists think about how, we as a society can create that environment, but also like, what does that look like at Positive Tracks, and like how do we create an environment that's welcoming, but also doesn't feel like we need to, like carry everyone with us. I think that's a tough thing that I don't particularly have the answer to,
I think like these were very intelligent and sophisticated answers about how we, like, the alternative to canceling people, but like the reality is like it's happening. Right? And like our generation is doing it.
Oh yeah.
So like like whether or not we like agree with whether that's like the right course of action, and obviously it's going to be case by case. Like I do believe sometimes like someone needs to not be in a space because of the way that they've acted, and like that. I just think that's kind of fundamental, where it's like they're like if someone's presence makes other people not feel safe, and like it's really important that that space feels safe for everyone involved. Like I don't know, like I'm kind of like, I think I'd like for in a lot of cases I would like, if I had to make that choice, I would side on the person who didn't feel safe because somebody in the space like was there, and they their presence made them. So I don't know. I think it's like there's this kind of like almost like pie in the sky, like this is what we should do instead. But then there's also like the reality that we live with, that like this is something that happens all the time. It's like now that alternative narrative is out there about other ways that we can handle this better, but like it's happening. And a situation maybe I was thinking about that like relates to Positive Tracks is like, what do we do if like someone we're working with, the young person we're working with, is sort of like moving towards like the cancel, like the acting on cancel culture themselves. Like how do we interact with that young person? Because I don't know, like I think that like, to your point about the way that the media portrays it, like a lot of it is certainly like hyper, like it's inaccurate, and it's like blowing up certain like small situations into like way more than they may have actually been, or like there's not all the facts, so you create these narratives that like, oh my god, they got canceled for nothing, or what, like whatever, or canceled for something that like any of us would think is perfectly reasonable, right? But like that it's still real, right? Like it still exists, and it's something that like I don't know, I think it's maybe the question I just asked about positive tracks involvement isn't the right one to ask, or maybe it doesn't have an answer right now, and that's fine too. But like, it is real, and it's not done. It's like we're not past it.
Yeah, our generation in particular is like so polarized and so extreme when it comes to things, and I kind of talked about this before, which is why I believe in positive tracks so much, is because I tend to see in my life, the people, you know, my age around me, it's either, you know, apathy, complete apathy to everything in the world, or it's just this hyper polarization and extremes. And I think that's really because of a loss of the ability to, tying it back to listening, to take the me out of the situation and listen honestly and have a truthful discussion where you can agree to disagree, and that kind of like those aspects of like that sort of discussion, I think we've kind of lost, and that's what makes it tough for my generation. But I also think that Jasper made a great point, which is that, you know, there are times when you really just can't have a conversation with someone because they are someone that is not in the space or not ready to be in that space and to communicate and do all of those things. And just like it's okay to not be okay, it's also true that sometimes a person may never reach a point where they're, you know, ready to be in that space and be open and truthful and have an earnest discussion in that space. And you know, that can be unfortunate, but it goes back to what we were talking before again about, you know, we can't solve every problem, and if we look at every person as needing to be solved, which is where I think that cancel culture originates from. It's like we need to solve this person. I think we start to dehumanize people when we start to look at them as a problem that needs to be solved. Either I need to educate them, or I need to cancel them, or I need to do something, is where the problem arises. And I think we need to, again, take a step back and say, instead of doing, let me listen. You know, is this someone that we can engage with and have a conversation and get to the space, or is this someone that, you know, is never going to reach that point? And of course, that's not a perfect science. Sometimes you're wrong about that, sometimes you're right, but I think that we need to take a step back and, you know, add in that extra lens and layer to kind of, you know, make that evaluation at times.
Yeah, I want to build on both of your points, Jasper and Edith here, because I think one of the most toxic aspects of social media is the loss of subtlety that exists. Like
nuance.
It's the nuance, exactly. It's whatever's going to happen, and I do think that legitimately has contributed to polarization in society, among other things that have contributed to polarization. But the attention grabbing, the emotion, you know, wreaking, like that feature is so critical, and it prevents us from seeing the whole story. So I think I have like 2 friends who happen to be white males who were canceled big time, and they had big names, big positions, political power, and they were canceled, which is interesting because so many people gave the benefit of the doubt as they, you know, perhaps should. This is so hard to talk about because there's so many power subtleties in here, which is what we need to be talking about. But to the folks who were, you know, accusing these other folks of things, and so immediately they lost their ability to do the work that they were doing for things that, upon further investigation, they were not actually culpable of, which is a real loss to society at whole. Because obviously we need to hold people accountable for doing things that they should not be doing, but. So tricky. We cannot, like, you know, there's also definitely, we also can't take advantage of this propensity to make assumptions, to, like, even though there are underlying power structures, like bringing it back to the legal and justice piece, like due process. Everyone deserves due process, and that should take into account, obviously, factors of privilege and race and, you know, whatever other context exists. But everyone, whether you're being accused of some sort of atrocity or something, like, and that often doesn't happen in social media, and most of the cases that this canceling happened, it was sparked through a social media post saying, this person did this to me.
Right.
And that, it turns out that most, like, this is so hard to talk about because you always want to like, I talked about, you know, giving an ear to people who shouldn't have to explain themselves over and over and over again for experiencing oppression. But at the same time, there have been, you know, occasions which are far more rare, far more rare, where like the whole story hasn't been told. Right. And oftentimes that does happen on social media, sometimes not. But God, it goes both ways. It's so tricky, and it just requires due process, like, and looking at you as a human, like I think you mentioned too, like.
Yeah, I think
got a story.
Another thing that I think is really interesting to tie back to our earlier conversations is that a lot of times the cancel culture is tyranny of the minority, right? And I think that that's kind of like resonant throughout our society in this country. It's a select few voices that are the loudest, that are, you know, creating certain perceptions of the world we live in, and we all think, oh my God, the sky is falling down, when it's not really the case. But because those are the loudest voices, we don't really get to, you know, communicate and feel like things are okay, or really have a good appraisal of the situation that we're in. And I think that ties back again to positive tracks and things like voting and things like realizing that every voice counts, everything counts. And, you know, if we're in this situation where it's just the loudest voices that are constantly speaking, we're not going to feel like we're actually making real change, or that we're not going to be able to properly, you know the situation that we're in. And so I think that's why it's so important to focus on voting and focus on doing things like positive tracks, because it's like those are the spaces where individual voices really count and make an impact, and where you can feel like this is truly like the situation out there. There are 400 captains a year that are making an impact on the country and on, you know, topics that matter. It's not just the loud voices that are constantly yelling at me, telling me that things are bad. So I think that's a really important tie back too.
So I'm looking at the time, and this has been so valuable, but I wanted to give a moment if there's a question in the room, perhaps, that someone wants to ask this panel at all. Go, please.
I would love to know, if we said, what should you talk about today? What do you want to bring to the table today? Like, versus like, hey, this is our theme, it's allyship, right? Which is great because we need to have this discussion. But like, I want to know, because I want to go and read. I want to go and learn. I want to go and listen more. And so I would love to hear what that would have been, that you would have been like, here, I'm bringing this.
It'll be our next board meeting.
Yeah, it could be our next meeting.
I've been thinking about, this isn't really answering your question, it's kind of just like one thing I've noticed in myself, even like, is having like, especially since I graduated from college, like looking on social media or looking at, like, I'm already feeling this tendency to be like, oh, what is going on with this next generation? Like, I don't understand it.
Casper, that's so accurate.
Or like, I'm like, one thing I think is really, like, I'm having to like, when like I mean, is it like all these things, like, especially right now, just the one that comes to mind is just like gender. Like, the narrative around gender moves so quickly. It is moving so quickly right now, and some of the like, I was just listening to this podcast yesterday that was talking about, it was interviewing someone who just wrote a book about like the myth of being born in the wrong body, right? But like, I think when I was growing up, like, that's how transness was described, right? It was like, oh, some people just like, you know, maybe they don't know it from birth, but like, they just get this sense that, like, you know, the way that they're showing up in the world, the way that they look, like, isn't like aligning with who they are, how they were, you know. And like, this person was just describing how that's like really not the right way to talk about how transness feels for a lot of people. And this is not in regard to what I was saying earlier, but like, that was a totally new narrative for me. And obviously people like closer to that, you know, movement, or people who read a lot of like trans literature and stuff probably have known this for years and been talking about it or whatever, but it's the first time like I'd heard it like really out, you know, in like popular media. But taking that was an aside. But with these things moving as fast, and the like Overton window and the social sort of like what is socially accepted, how we talk about it, the language around them moving really quickly. Like, I've already been feeling in like the year and a half since I graduated from college that like some things are like, I'm like, wait, what? Like, or someone was even I think it's really natural to be like, someone was offended by what? right? Like, what?
Right.
Come on,
Imagine
right?
how we
and like
feel.
that. But I think just like a really good practice and something that I'm working on is when you think someone was offended by what, like, don't just stop there, right? It's like say like, okay, that's really interesting. I don't know what it like. That does not like. I clearly am missing something, right? Because like that was a human who was offended by something, right? Period.
And that's what
So
taking
then it's like, okay, well, like let's
right.
learn, right? Like
That's right. That's right.
and like even if it's not something, or even if it's not like a form of discrimination or a form of like, even if it's a microaggression that I just like had never been aware of, right? It's like, let's just stop and like sit in the fact that someone was, felt unsafe, uncomfortable, whatever, and then like let's hopefully like learn and dig in, right? So that's been just something I've been reflecting on. It's like the question was like, how does the next generation, like, I'm already feeling like that, right? And like I feel like it's moving really fast, which is great. Like I think it's really good that it's moving fast, but it can be hard to keep up. And just being like constantly curious, I think, is a big way that the older generation, whether it's like literally us or whether it's older than us, can be good allies.
Jasper, that's rich, because I think you and I were talking last night, and part of that is, like you say, period, and saying it just is, and it's valid for that person,
Right.
and that warrants a deeper dive, perhaps, and doing that, but also taking the pressure off yourself to feel perfect, to say like, I got to get this right, and I think a lot of times when we do that, we inhibit the growth that can happen for just awareness. Yeah, so I appreciate that, and I'm glad you're feeling that already. So,
I think it so ties into taking the ego out of it. Like that's a huge takeaway for me.
Yeah.
Even in actually listening, like listen to understand. There's no agenda.
Yes.
You're not going to try. Don't listen to change someone else's mind. Don't listen to try to help with what you think you were already prescribed. Even when you're like taking the ego out of even when you experience that feeling, you're like, wait, what did you get offended by? Like that's about your own ego is what that actually is. Totally. Rather than hearing that to understand it. It's like this human defense. When you encounter something you don't know, we're wired to think that that's dangerous.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it like goes back to Darwin.
Yeah.
And so we instantly want to jump at, well, that's got to be wrong because I don't get it. And we go into defense mode. And that's really about our own stuff.
Yeah.
And I'd love to answer Rose's question about like, again, I don't know if this is a perfect answer, but I'd love to do this more often, right? I think that for me, Positive Tracks always helps me stay grounded in terms of like keeping hope and, reality check. Like I'm engaged a lot because of Positive Tracks, because you can get really siloed. My career in the hospital doesn't really have anything to do with this sort of work, and so you really get into it, and you maybe sometimes start to feel less in tune, less in touch, and less passionate because you're not doing that work on a day-to-day basis. But something like Positive Tracks keeps me grounded, and I think for the organization itself to keep it grounded, I think these conversations are vital, and to help us as a team continue to be reality checked and passionate about the work that we do. I think these sorts of philosophical conversations are really important, where it's an open discussion, where we bridge generational gaps, where we have honest learning and open truthful discussions and no agenda discussions about what's really going on in the world. Maybe this is a learning point to talk about something. Maybe this is a chance to share. Maybe this is a chance to just have that conversation. I think on a regular basis will help keep the vision and the mission and like the passion of all of us in doing this work alive as we keep growing and moving forward. I think that's something that I'd love to do more frequently. I think it's also quite important. So
I hate to be the bearer at 2:30, and I think that's the time wise. This has been so helpful. I'm just looking at the rest of the folks as far as the meeting is concerned, but this has been so, first of all, thanking the panel, right? You guys is wonderful. I'm thanking Dia and Brian for making time to be there, and I think Amy's there.